Welcome back, everyone. Ready for another deep dive?
Always.
Today, we're going to tackle Mary Wollstonecraft,
Oh, fascinating.
her book, A Vindication of the Rights of Woman.
Yeah,
It's a classic of feminist thought,
definitely.
but we're going to try to go a little deeper
Okay.
beyond the usual feminist icon
I
narrative.
like it.
Now, we all know that she's considered a pioneer for women's rights,
Mm.
but
Mm-hmm.
her work didn't exactly spark an immediate revolution, did it?
It's true. Her ideas were, in many ways, ahead of their time.
It's almost like she was planting seeds
Yes.
that would take root
Yeah.
much later. Why do you think that was?
Well, I think it gets to the core of what she was really trying to achieve. You see, her vision wasn't just about securing political rights for women,
Okay.
although that was certainly a part of it.
Right?
She was fundamentally arguing for social and economic emancipation,
Really?
empowering women to
Yeah.
be active contributors to society.
Not just confined to the domestic sphere.
Exactly.
It's about changing mindsets.
Yes.
Societal structures,
Yeah.
economic realities.
Hmm.
This is where it gets really interesting, I think.
Definitely.
So to really understand Wollstonecraft's arguments,
Yeah.
we need to rewind the clock back to 18th century England.
Okay.
What was the intellectual landscape like back then? Paint us a picture.
All right. Well, picture this. It's a time of immense intellectual change. It's a period we call the Enlightenment. New ideas about reason, individual liberty, and the role of government are sweeping across Europe.
Challenging the old ways of thinking.
Absolutely. It's a time of revolution in thought.
Well,
And it's sparking real revolutions, too.
right, like in America and France.
Exactly.
So I'm guessing a key figure here is
Oh, absolutely.
John Locke.
You got it. Locke's ideas about natural rights, individual liberty, the right to rebel against tyrannical governments, they were incredibly influential during this period.
Yeah, the idea that governments get their power
Yeah.
from the consent of the governed.
Exactly. And that individuals have inherent rights that no government can take away.
Those ideas would eventually form the basis of modern democracies.
Right. Human rights, representative government, the limits of state power.
So these ideas find fertile ground in England.
Very much so. England was undergoing its own political and social transformations. And this is where we introduce a key concept, Whiggism.
Whiggism.
Yeah.
All right, break that down for me. What exactly is that?
So Whiggism was this political philosophy that championed parliamentary supremacy, individual liberty, and a government based on the consent of the people. They were the folks who really believed in no taxation without representation, advocating for greater power to the people through parliament.
So while Locke provides the philosophical framework, Whiggism is putting those ideas into action in the political arena.
Exactly. But here's the thing. Whiggism wasn't a single unified bloc.
Oh.
Within Whiggism, there was a spectrum of views,
Okay.
with some pushing those core Whig ideals even further.
So you have your mainstream Whigs who are focused on reforming the existing system.
Yes.
And then you have your, radical Whigs.
That's a good way to put it. These radical Whigs, they were thinking more along the lines of like, okay, what if we reimagine the whole structure of society?
More revolutionary than reformists.
Yes, exactly. Thinkers like Thomas Paine, for example, were fiercely critical of the British Constitution. They advocated for universal suffrage, which was a really radical idea at the time.
Yeah.
And they argued for a more egalitarian distribution of power. They were pushing the boundaries of acceptable political discourse.
And this is where I think we start to see Wollstonecraft fitting into the picture.
You're getting it. She wasn't exactly hanging out with the conservative, tea-sipping Whigs.
No, she was in a much more radical crowd.
That's right. To understand Wollstonecraft, we need to delve into a specific group within this radical Whig world,
Yeah.
Protestant dissenters.
Dissenters, as in those who disagreed with the Church
Yeah.
of England.
Exactly. But their dissent wasn't just about religious matters. It extended to their political and social views as well.
Oh, interesting.
They were deeply inspired by thinkers like Locke. They were fiercely debating the meaning of equality, individual liberty, and who deserved a voice in society.
So these weren't just polite theological debates. These were high-stakes discussions.
Absolutely. These dissenters, they faced real consequences for their beliefs. Legal discrimination, social ostracism, it was serious. But they were a vibrant intellectual community, and they were challenging the status quo, pushing for greater freedom.
And this is where we start to see the connection to Wollstonecraft.
You're on the right track. She was deeply embedded in this world of dissenting thought. In fact, she was close friends with leading dissenting figures like Richard Price.
He was a prominent minister and political philosopher, right?
That's right, very influential in those circles.
So Wollstonecraft wasn't just exposed to these radical ideas. She was right in the thick of these debates, challenging conventional wisdom alongside some of the leading thinkers of her time.
Exactly. And to give you a sense of the energy and passion that was swirling around these discussions, here's a quote from Richard Price. "What an eventful period is this! I have lived to see the rights of men better understood than ever, nations panting for liberty."
Wow, you could just feel the passion
Right.
and the conviction in his words. It's almost like you could hear the echoes of the American and French revolutions in there.
Absolutely.
So this brings us to the crux of it. How did this environment of dissenting thought, with its focus on individual liberty and challenging the status quo, how did it shape Wollstonecraft's arguments for women's rights?
Well, that's a great question, and it's one we're going to dig into right after this break. Wollstonecraft, she took those core Enlightenment principles, the ones championed by thinkers like Locke, and she applied them to women.
It seems so obvious now, but it was revolutionary at the time.
It really was. She argued that women, just like men, are rational beings capable of reason and self-governance.
So she's challenging that whole idea that women are somehow inherently inferior to men.
Exactly. She's saying that any perceived deficiencies in women are due to a lack of education and opportunity.
Not because of some biological limitation.
Right. And she's doing all of this in 1792.
Right in the middle of revolutions in America and France.
Talk about revolutionary. It was a time when the very foundations of society were being questioned, and she dared to ask, hey, if governments derive their legitimacy from the consent of the governed, like Locke argued, then shouldn't women also have a voice in the political process?
If education is the key to unlocking human potential, why are women being denied access to the same educational opportunities as men? It's so simple, but so powerful.
It is, and she was so skilled at connecting these broader political and philosophical debates to the very specific issue of women's rights.
She wasn't just tinkering around the edges, she was challenging the very structures of power and privilege.
Absolutely, and one of the best examples of this is her critique of Jean-Jacques Rousseau.
Another prominent Enlightenment thinker.
Yeah, but he had some pretty problematic views about women.
That's putting it mildly.
In his book Emile, Rousseau argues that women should be educated primarily for the pleasure of men, focusing on developing skills like obedience and charm.
Instead of intellectual independence. I remember reading that, and it made my blood boil.
I know, right? The idea that a woman's education should be geared towards pleasing men rather than cultivating her own mind, her own potential.
Infuriating.
And Wollstonecraft just dismantles his argument.
Tell me she takes him down.
Oh, she does. She points out how Rousseau's theories just reinforce those inequalities that keep women in a subordinate position.
Right. Denying women access to education keeps them from reaching their full potential.
Exactly. You're limiting their ability to contribute to society, to live fulfilling lives.
And this critique of Rousseau, it gets to the heart of what Wollstonecraft was fighting for.
It's not just about equal rights under the law.
Right. It's about equal access to education, equal opportunities for personal growth, the recognition of a woman's inherent worth and dignity.
Exactly. And she goes even further. She argues that educating women isn't just beneficial for women themselves, it's essential for the well-being of society as a whole.
Interesting. So she's making a pragmatic argument as well as a moral one.
Exactly. She believed that educated women would make better mothers, better citizens, better contributors to the economic and intellectual life of their nation.
So she's saying that empowering women isn't just a matter of fairness, it's a matter of societal progress. It's good for everyone.
Exactly. And all of these ideas culminate in her most famous work, A Vindication of the Rights of Women, published in 1792.
Okay, so let's dive into that book. What are some of the key arguments she lays out?
Well, first and foremost, she argues that women, just like men, are endowed with reason and they're capable of making rational choices.
They can govern their own lives.
Right. And she challenges the notion of separate spheres.
The idea that men belong in the public sphere, in politics and business, while women are relegated to the home and family.
Exactly. Wollstonecraft is saying, let's dismantle those artificial barriers that limit women's participation in society. She argued that women should have equal access to education, equal opportunities in the workforce, and the right to participate in government.
Wow, these were really radical ideas for their time. It's no wonder she faced a lot of backlash.
She did. She was a woman challenging the very foundations of patriarchal society.
And let's be honest, her personal life didn't help her case. I mean,
No.
she was held to a completely different standard than her male counterpart.
Oh, absolutely. Wollstonecraft had a daughter out of wedlock. She was open about her relationships, her views on marriage. It made her a target.
Because she dared to live her life on her own terms. It's a sad reminder that even brilliant minds like Wollstonecraft weren't immune to the double standards and the societal pressures of their time.
It's true. But despite all the criticism, her work continued to circulate, and her ideas found new life in later generations.
She really laid the groundwork for future feminist movements.
Absolutely. Her writings inspired countless women and men to challenge those gender norms and fight for equality. And her impact wasn't limited to England either.
Right, her ideas spread across continents. For our UPSC aspirants, that global reach is really important to keep in mind.
It is. Wollstonecraft's work provides this crucial historical lens through which to understand the evolution of global feminist movements.
For arguments about reason, about equality, the need for women's full participation in society, they've resonated across cultures and time periods.
Exactly. And that emphasis on social and economic emancipation, it's particularly relevant to today's debates about international development, human rights, and the role of women in global affairs.
So when we talk about empowering women in developing countries, closing the gender gap in education and employment, making sure women have equal access to healthcare and political participation,
We're essentially echoing the arguments that Wollstonecraft made centuries ago.
her work isn't just some dusty old historical artifact. It's a living document that continues to inform and inspire our efforts to create a more just and equitable world. But I'm curious, how do you think understanding Wollstonecraft's historical context, that whole world of radical Whigs and dissenters, how does that help us understand her arguments and their impact?
That's a great question. By understanding the intellectual ferment of her time, those debates about individual liberty, the role of government, what a just society should look like, we can see how Wollstonecraft's ideas were both a product of her time and a radical departure from it.
She was building on the ideas of Locke's, the principles of Whiggism.
But she was pushing them further.
Exactly. And she was applying them to a group that had been largely excluded from those conversations.
Women. So she was both a radical and a pragmatist, drawing upon existing intellectual frameworks while also challenging their limitations. And it strikes me that understanding this context, this historical context, is really valuable for our listeners, especially those UPSC aspirants, you know?
The ones who are focusing on international relations. It's like having a secret decoder ring or something.
I like that.
For understanding the complexities of global politics, how human rights have evolved over time.
Absolutely. Wollstonecraft's work, it gives us valuable insights into the philosophical roots of human rights discourse, those arguments about reason, equality, individual liberty.
It's all connected.
They resonate so deeply with the principles we see in documents like the Universal Declaration of Human Rights.
So it's not just about feminism, right? It's about the history of ideas that have shaped the world we live in.
Right.
And for those preparing for the UPSC exams, this kind of historical analysis,
Oh, yeah.
it's super important.
It is. It is.
Especially for like tackling those essay questions, navigating those interviews.
Absolutely. Being able to connect those historical events and intellectual currents to the issues we're facing today.
Right.
That's key.
That's a key skill for anyone aspiring to a career in diplomacy or international affairs.
For sure. And Wollstonecraft's work, it provides such rich material for understanding how ideas about gender, equality, human rights, how all of that has evolved over time.
Okay, so as we wrap up our deep dive, let's try to distill some key takeaways for our listeners,
Okay.
especially for those UPSC aspirants who are gearing up for those tough exams. What are the nuggets of wisdom
Yeah, the nuggets.
that they should carry with them
Yeah.
from this exploration of Wollstonecraft?
Well, I think the first thing to remember is that Wollstonecraft, she wasn't just some lone voice crying out in the wilderness. Her ideas came out of this specific historical and intellectual context. And to really understand her, you have to understand that context.
Right. She was part of that vibrant intellectual community, engaging with those Enlightenment ideas, challenging traditional power structures alongside the radical Whigs and dissenters.
Yeah, it's like she was standing on the shoulders of giants, but she also took those ideas to new heights.
Exactly. And for our UPSC folks, this is a reminder. that when you're analyzing historical events or figures,
Mm.
you got to consider that broader context,
Yeah.
the intellectual currents, the social and political movements that shaped their thinking.
It's not enough to just memorize names and dates. You have to understand the forces that drive history.
You need that secret decoder ring,
Yeah.
right, to really make sense of it all. And speaking of connections, I think another key takeaway is Wollstonecraft's focus on social and economic emancipation.
Oh, absolutely. It wasn't just about political rights.
Right. She understood that true equality wouldn't come from just giving women the right to vote or to hold office. It was about dismantling the systems that kept women from reaching their full potential. Those barriers in education, the workforce, social norms, expectations.
Oh, just all of it.
Yeah.
All of it.
And that really resonates with the debates we're having today about gender equality and development both within countries and globally. It's a reminder that achieving gender equality requires a multifaceted approach. You have to address the legal and political barriers, but also the social, economic, and cultural ones.
Exactly. For those studying international relations, that's such a crucial point. When you're analyzing issues like women's rights, global development, human rights, you have to consider how all these different factors are intertwined, and Wollstonecraft gives us this framework for understanding that.
And finally, I think Wollstonecraft's own example, her fearless critique of the status quo, her willingness to challenge even big-name thinkers like Rousseau.
Oh, she didn't back down from anyone.
It's inspiring, right?
It is.
Especially for those who are hoping to take on leadership roles in the future. The world needs more critical thinkers,
Yes.
more courageous advocates. It's a quality that's essential for anyone who wants to make a difference.
Whether they're diplomats or policymakers, activists, or just engaged citizens, that courage to speak truth to power is so important.
So, as we leave Wollstonecraft's world and come back to our own, I want to leave you with one last thought-provoking question. How can understanding her historical context, her engagement with Enlightenment ideas in those radical circles, help us better understand the challenges and opportunities facing feminist movements today around the world?
That's a great question to ponder. And I think, as we've seen, the fight for gender equality, it's an ongoing struggle. It's shaped by historical forces, cultural context, and the tireless efforts of those who dare to challenge the way things are.
And by understanding the intellectual root to these movements, we can gain a deeper appreciation for their complexities, their nuances, and that long, long journey towards a more just and equitable world.
Absolutely.
And if you enjoyed our deep dive into history, ideas, and the lasting legacy of Mary Wollstonecraft, don't forget to like and subscribe to our channel for more explorations of fascinating topics. Until next time, keep those minds curious and keep those conversations flowing.